Hi, welcome to the second iteration of my Coffee Break HEMA series, where I try and get a point across about HEMA while my coffee brews. For the next few, I'm going to talk a bit about safety, different aspects of safety, and for this one, I particularly want to talk about kind of what it is that makes HEMA safe, or what it is that we have to make HEMA safe, which I think is not as explicit as it could be for a lot of different areas. In general, HEMA is a relatively safe sport in the sense that there are not that many injuries when you compare it to, say, rugby or American football or something like that. But I do think we could and should have fewer than we do. I don't think that in general, in the course of regular operations, if there's nothing, no kind of equipment failure or anything like that, people should not be getting any kind of serious injury or even minor injury more than a bruise. And we don't necessarily have the full kind of understanding of why that doesn't happen more than it does. And I think you see this a lot when groups kind of interact. And I guess the real main thing I wanted to come across with is that there are, at any given time in what you're doing, three things that are keeping people safe. And each of these should be explicit, but for the most part, they are kind of implicit and not really thought about. I think the two most obvious ones that people often default to are gear, right? We wear protective gear, which is obviously intended to keep us safe. So, a fencing mask, jacket, gloves, or whatever you need. Gorget, this kind of stuff. And I'll talk a bit more about protective gear in some later video, I'm sure. But that's the obvious one that people jump to. The second obvious one that people are less explicit about than they should be, but they still people are pretty explicit, is your sword, right? Obviously, we're not using a sharp sword. The swords that we have safety measures built into them, flared tips, wider edges, degree of flexibility, where the weight is balanced, different kind of stuff, tips if you put them on. So there's something about the sword, the weapon that you're using that increases safety as well. And then the third, and this one is very rarely, in my experience, explicit, and really, really should be, is the conventions that you adopted. And the reason I say it's really explicit is you see this a lot when people kind of, different clubs come together, right? That different people have different standard conventions for what they consider to be acceptable. Tournaments impose a set, so they're explicit in tournaments. Tournaments say, these are the kinds of actions you can do, these are the kinds of actions you can't do, and there is, it's an implicit assumption that if you go in a tournament, you are going to be going at whatever pace you feel like going at, and there's nothing to tell you that. But when we're sparring, when we're in training, there are conventions about what's acceptable within the bounds of a drill, what's acceptable within the bounds of sparring, most of which are going to be given by the club that you're in. And from what I can tell, most clubs rarely make them explicit, or the instructor has given a set and everybody's followed the same kind of set. The problem with this being kind of an implicit set of assumptions is most of the time people are not aware of this. And this is true of gear and weapons to a lesser extent as well. Probably everybody in your club has a similar set of gear. You've probably gone by what you've seen everybody else is using or what the instructors have recommended. And you've kind of all got a similar set of protective equipment, similar set of weapons. And you've probably all fencing in a very similar set of conventions, again, without necessarily having been conscious of what they are. But then when you encounter another group, they've got different set, maybe they've got stiffer swords or more flexible swords, so they feel that they can go more comfortably faster or slower. And you get this kind of meeting of groups. What happens is that one person is expecting the fight to go one way, the fencing match to go one way, another person is expecting to go another way. And sometimes it's fine, and sometimes it causes severe issues. The event that I have seen the most injuries in was a fairly informal cross-club sparring event. People came with different expectations of what sparring was. People came with different sets of gear. I think there were, for this event of maybe 20 people, there were probably about 4 different hand injuries, at least 2 of which were taken to hospital. And it's not that people were being necessarily unsafe in sort of a grander sense. The things that they were doing were probably perfectly fine within the club. But when people came with different implicit expectations for what things were going to happen, things start to fall apart. So the point I'm really trying to make here is that all of these things that are helping contribute to be safe need to be absolutely explicit at all times, both, well, particularly when you are interacting with a different club, but also within your own club. And it's very easy to kind of forget that we are fencing on a particular set of conventions that are not universal when you're sparring with the same set of people over and over again. And if you are in that kind of group, you don't even need to talk about conventions most of the time. And we mandate in our club having a conversation before we spar to agree what conventions you're fencing under. I'll talk about that in a later video probably. And when you're fencing somebody that you fenced a dozen, 100 times, you don't need to have a long conversation. You can just say, we're going to do anything different to what we normally do? No? Okay, cool, let's go at it. But it's still an explicit agreement that you are doing that. And the same is true of weapons, right? So I had a sparring with one of my students the other day, and we were in the same gear that we normally do. We were wearing the same, we were fencing on the same conventions as we normally do. We had a very quick conversation, just said, yeah, let's do what we normally do. But he was using a sword I'd never seen before, and I didn't check it beforehand. I should have, because I just assumed it was kind of safe. And it was, I think it was a Tabasco sword, and the stiffness on the sword was unbelievably stiff. I am in the camp that the stiff end of Regeniers are probably fine. Some people disagree. This was way stiffer than anything in that. And a couple thrusts in, I was like, hang on a sec, I think maybe I need to stop and we need to reevaluate what we're doing. This kind of mistake is really common when you're changing one of these three kinds of things and not one of the others. So in particular, one thing you see commonly is people get injured when they downgrade their weapon, or rather they make a weapon more safe by switching to foam. And I've seen this many, many times. People switch to foam, like, I'm using a safe weapon, fantastic, nothing can go wrong. What happens? They implicitly, without discussing it, adapt the conventions. They go faster, they go harder, because they can safely. And I've seen people get bloody noses because they thought they didn't need a mask. I've seen people injure their hands because they thought they didn't need proper gloves, and that they could just go faster and more faster, harder. Not worry too much about pulling up blows and that kind of stuff because the weapon is supposed to be safe. So all in all, the main thing I want to get across here is that every time you fence, you are being kept safe by a number of different things, and it is both the protective equipment, the weapons that you're using, and the conventions that you have agreed with your partner implicitly or explicitly. And to be safe, you should make all three of these things explicit rather than implicit. You shouldn't assume that someone is wearing all the protective kit that you think they are. You should check. You shouldn't assume that the weapon that they're using is one which is perfectly fine. You should check, or trust a kit check at a tournament if it is a tournament. And the conventions that you're going to fence under should be by agreement, explicit agreement, and something that you are both signed up to doing, because otherwise accidents happen, not because anyone's being a dick, but because people have not realized what's actually going on. Thanks for watching. Stay safe.